Explain to us also what sorrow makes you weep as you listen to the tragic story of the Argives and the fall of Troy. The gods were responsible for that, weaving catastrophe into men's lives to make a song for future generations.
All right, you guys. This week, Tabletop Tune Up gets religion. We are continuing our series on world building, and we're going to start with religion, and I want to ask Mark about that in a moment. But before I ask him about that, I want to ask him about this. Mark, you went off to a summer camp experience. Tell me about that. What were you doing, and how was it? Tell me all about it.
It was a lot of fun. I do volunteer work at Seattle Children's Hospital out in the Pacific Northwest. The camp takes about 100 kids to go experience the fun that is camp. You get to go fishing, horseback riding, do some archery, all sorts of tomfoolery and hijinks.
That's great.
It was exhausting work. Looking forward to doing it next year.
And you've done it for several years now, I think, haven't you?
Oh, yeah. Probably about, 12 years now or so.
Wow. That's great. What keeps you going back every year?
I always think of it as, some people like to vacation to kind of, restore their bodies and their minds. This is, this kind of camp is one that restores your faith in humanity. Ben, I got to tell you, before I get to camp, I'm about as grumpy as you can get. I'm cynical. I'm a little salty. After camp, I feel a little bit better. I feel like these kids kind of infuse with you a spirit of, it ain't that bad.
That's great.
So
That's
I love
really
it.
Wonderful.
I love it.
I'd love to hear more about that sometime. I love it when you come back with those stories. So that's fantastic. Well, hey, everybody, we're going to get into world building in earnest this week. In our last episode, you may remember that we spent some time basically talking about how to build worlds, how to build your world, why to build your world, things like that. This week, we're going to delve into what we think is the first topic when you're building your world, the religious dimension. We're going to think about that, though, in a few different ways. We're going to talk about that in terms of both the big sort of metaphysical powers that may shape your world. Those are sort of very prominent in a fantasy story. But then you've also got other kinds of things. In modern games, for example, you have Call of Cthulhu. In futuristic games, there's elder beings that have been hanging around the galaxy for a long time. Now, before we get into all that kind of stuff and examine the powers, or before we start thinking about the other part of this, which will be something about institutional religion, like what about churches and temples and things like that? Mark, I'm very curious. Why is this the place that you prefer to start when you're doing world building?
Yeah, we could start here at religion. We could also start at mapping. They're kind of the two places I typically like to start when thinking about these things. But let's just pick religion. I mean, one will inform the other. So it really doesn't matter which one you want to do. But let's go ahead and start with religion, because religion will inform us on geography. As
the divine beings that kind of create the world and the things that are in it, they're going to sort of have that relationship to the map that's going to be different.
Correct. And also geography does inform us of the types of religions that one might encounter. If you are in an arid desert area, you might worship a sun god.
Right.
Or something of that nature. So these things do matter. Geography is important.
Island cultures will probably have sea gods and so forth.
Yeah, correct.
Interesting. Okay. So maps or religion, both good places to start. And friends, our next couple episodes, we're going to talk about mapping a bit. And we're going to get into how to do maps. We're going to get into how to bring those to life. And we're actually looking forward to an interview with one of our dear friends, our OG DM. And we'll tell you more about that another time, but he's a really good mapper. And so we're going to get more into that later. Now, we're going to talk about two aspects of religion. And one of these are going to be essentially the big metaphysical powers that make the world what it is. And then the other one's going to be kind of the institutional religions that are probably all over your world. And Mark, I actually have spent time teaching some of this stuff in higher ed. And I taught philosophy and religious studies and stuff like that.
I wouldn't hold that against you.
That's good. You don't need to kind of get into all of that to create a great set of deities for your game or some great elder powers in your science fiction universe or what have you. But the more you learn about it, I think the richer you can make your game. For today, though, we're just going to kind of gesture at ways that could be helpful. And we're going to kind of move past those without kind of delving too deep. I mean, this could be an entire series if you wanted to make it that, but we're going to stay kind of at the very top level. Let's start with powers. How do powers shape stories?
Powers and religion can shape all sorts of stories. If you look at classical fantasy books or even historical writing, things like at the top of our segment here, we had a quote from Homer's The Odyssey. The gods were pivotal to that storyline. The storyline wouldn't exist without them. They were the shapers and the movers of some of the things behind all those armies moving and fighting.
That's great. And of course, fantasy games borrow some of those ideas. This idea of, again, in Dungeons and Dragons normally, right? Clerics are drawing on these powers, warlocks and paladins drawing on these divine powers. You could even think of druids as kind of having a nature religion, drawing on the power of nature, and all of these can do magical effects.
Since we brought up Homer, which would be more fantasy, what about like modern games and science fiction, Ben? What do you think about those?
Interestingly, in modern games, I think a couple prominent examples. People think, like, do you have to go in for gods and religion and kind of the standard extant world religions we have now? You could absolutely do, and there have been games where you have angels and demons and things like that. But you can also look at this in terms of Call of Cthulhu, right? Where you've got these amazing elder beings and these terrifying realities, right? That's why we're using this word powers instead of religion as such when we're talking about this, because whatever it is that's shaping your world and its destiny, that's the thing that is the power in your world. So again, in Call of Cthulhu, Sandman. Think about Neil Gaiman's Sandman.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
That was a fantastic series on Netflix, by the way. I don't know if you got a chance to see it, Ben, but they did it really well.
One of my favorite things in that series was the duel between Lucifer and Dream. What's interesting about that, right, is if you're thinking currently about divinities and powers and things like that, and you kind of find your thinking kind of locked into, the divine powers of a D&D game. Well, look at what Neil Gaiman did with the Endless. These are different aspects of human psychology. You could arrange an entire pantheon that way instead of in relation to primary elements. If you're thinking about the future, I know you and I disagree about this. And, I believe someday, I have faith, Mark, someday you will come around to Babylon 5.
No, just stop with that.
It's great. Anyways, it's Hugo Award winning. All right. I can see we're going to divide the audience if we press you on this matter too much. In Babylon 5 and in lots of other science fiction games and media, you find these kind of ancient precursor deity-like alien races that have engineered the universe in certain ways, or they've exercised great power, or whatever they've done. But there's plenty of room for that in a science fiction game.
Yeah, but we're playing a tabletop game, and this is about the characters at the table. How do these powers shape the characters?
Powers can exist in any of these settings we've talked about. And in any of those settings, the really interesting thing is how are they active in the world and what response does that invite from the characters? Do the characters respond to the actions and the presence of the gods or the powers or whatever it is that you've got with fidelity? Like they're faithful, they want to engage with these powers because they see these as good things, or maybe it's defiance. Maybe they look at these divine beings and say, I'm not going to worship you. I'm going to go my own way. I'm going to throw it in your face and do other things or whatever. Maybe these beings, these divinities, whatever they are, inspire your characters. And your characters go, you know what? I need to do this or that because of such and so related to the way that your powers are going. Or again, conversely, terror. And this is very typical of a Call of Cthulhu game. These things are out there. They're inspiring terror if you get just a glimpse of them. What a horrible thing.
In a D&D game, your character could be motivated by terror as well. Maybe
that's right.
You worship, your character's worshiping some god that is just terrifying.
Well, this is one of the things I thought was really clever about a cleric you made once upon a time. He was a dwarven cleric named Gerard. And Gerard was a cleric who actually kind of hated his god. Can you tell us a little bit about who Gerard was and what you did with him?
I was really just kind of thinking about Old Testament kind of stuff where the deity was to be feared in many ways. So I was thinking about that, and I was like, what if this guy worshipped this god only out of fear? That's it. He felt like that deity was looking over his shoulder and was going to injure him or his family if he didn't obey. And so that's kind of what was my thinking. This wasn't a bad character. He was actually a good person. He wanted to do good. But there was somebody looking over his shoulder he was terrified of, which motivated him to do things.
Fascinating. Well, what's interesting about these characters, right? No matter how you envision the way that the deities or the powers that you envision in your world might operate, what kinds of interests they have, as always, if you're going to build that into your characters' stories, remember they're not your characters. This isn't writing a novel. This is a role-playing game. And so your players have to have a role in that. So, Mark, talk a little bit about how you approach players about this, or do you wait for them to approach you, or what's the negotiation like when you're trying to build some of this material into your characters' stories?
Well, I definitely let the players drive that narrative, what they want to do with their character. That's up to them. And I'm just kind of there to listen and offer suggestions about how I can do this. I would ideally like to weave these throughout the game so that there could be somewhat of a hero's journey over the course of a campaign. I don't want to be rushing into things too quickly. I want things to kind of gradually move along so that they can experience it and the players who are playing with them can kind of experience this journey. And there might be twists and turns along the way, but this is all player driven. Let them communicate to you what they want and just be open to listen.
That's great. Okay, so we're talking about different ways that these powers or deities might shape your story. We're talking about these ways that these might give your characters something to respond to. So let's actually start tuning up these powers. Let's build up our Pantheon here. If you're going to build this, if you're going to power up your Pantheon, as we say in the title, let's think about how we do that. So Mark, rapid fire around for a couple of questions here. Do we stat these gods?
Hard no. Definitely not.
Hard no.
I mean, they're really just story elements. Unless maybe you're like at level 20 and you have some storyline when they want to go fight the gods, then maybe you stat them if that's your thing. But in general, these are just story elements, and they should be left off in the distance and allow those stats to let them not think about stats.
Yeah, I think my rationale for this is that anything you stat, your players will try to find a way to break and to overcome.
There's that too.
And so almost it's like a temptation. Yeah. Like I kind of don't want to stat them, and I just want to say, listen, I don't care what strategy you have. It's a god, you're going to lose. And then to your point, there may be occasions when you want to stat them or do something like that. But I think those are very, very rare. And I think when you do that, you tend to like undercut the concept and the power that these things should have in the imagination a little bit.
Yeah, you want to leave them into the aspect of the player's imagination. So, but one thing we do want to do, Ben, origin stories.
Origin stories. Cosmogonies, I think, are the way that they used to call those.
Is that a word?
It's a word. It's the origin of the universe as told by myths.
I think you're just making words up now, Ben.
Well, okay. I'll let you go look it up and you can tell me later.
So look, we want to work on those origin stories. These are important because if you think about most religions, a big part of them is the mythology that we've kind of built up around these. And that is both interesting, it's beautiful, it informs you about the world. Sometimes it can inform you about the world creation. There are just these really interesting stories. I think of things like Thor drinking the ocean. That's why the tides exist, because he's trying to get to the Midgard serpent. What a cool illustration of how they're explaining the natural world.
Yeah. So one thing I think is interesting to do is to think about whether the gods have an origin story or whether you want to tell a story about a god that is the creator of all of the things in your universe, right? And so which comes first? Is it the world and the realities there, and then the gods kind of emerge from that? And you'll see that in the Greek mythology, the Norse mythology, a lot of those. Obviously, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you're going to see something much more like, hey, there's this creator god, and he creates the universe and all of the things that flow out of that. All of these creation myths, they tend to do two things. Number one, they tend to tell a story about how the world gets created or formed. And you can do this. If you go back and look at Genesis, the first 3 days of creation are forming the shape of the world, the water, the sky, the land, all that stuff. the next 3 days of creation are filling the world with all of its creatures and animals and plants and human beings ultimately. And so those two behaviors, forming and filling, you'll see that in Genesis. You'll see that in Tolkien in the Silmarillion if you study that. And you'll see it in a lot of other ancient mythologies as well. Even if the gods are kind of derivative in some way, you'll get some story about how order comes out of chaos, and the world that we know takes the shape it has, and it's then filled with plants and creatures and humans, and how that works tells you a little bit about what their role is supposed to be in that game, in that story about the world.
Yeah, and you also want to think about these are myths. These are stories that would be handed down through generations. And you got to think about how that might, in your game, how that might sound. And how even within your cultures, when you start going into mapping, how those different cultures might interpret these stories and how they might bend them in different ways to their particular region. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these different regions might bend the stories a little bit to their advantage in some ways. These are things to consider. And gosh, origin stories are so interesting. Don't skimp out on them. Give it consideration, give it thought.
How do we organize these? What kinds of deities should we make? I mean, the kind of the classic thing I think a lot of people have in their heads is, deities that have like power over certain domains. Like this is the god of the sea and that's the god of the sky. Is that a good strategy, or do we need to do other things? Or what do you recommend here?
It's not a bad strategy. You choose what you feel is important for your game and the stories you want to tell. But those could be very fun ways. People like themes of earth, air, fire, water, but also like you could look at like really interesting pantheons like in Sandman, where we're talking about these different deities and how they manifest in the psyche, in the mind. That's a really interesting pantheon right there.
Sometimes these things are a little asymmetric too. One of the things that makes Warhammer such a dark universe is that the gods in that universe are all super evil, and they're not organized according to kind of classic elemental themes, like we're saying, like sky or sea or things like that. They're organized in terms of chaotic change. They're organized in terms of things like lust and decay and bloodshed, right? Having only those kinds of gods in your world is going to create a terrifying world. But yeah, I got to say, it seems to be working for the Games Workshop guys.
Yeah, I will say, just think about like the kind of game you want to play and how these powers might inform that type of game. If you want to play a wild, chaotic game like Warhammer, they make absolute sense in that world. They're consistent. So just be consistent. Think about the type of game you want to play and how these powers might express that.
So in addition to their power, one other thing to think about is, what are their agendas? What kinds of rivalries can you set up? Are the gods active in your world, or are they inactive in your world? And whatever it is that the gods are doing or not doing, whatever it is that these ancient elder beings are doing, if you're thinking about sort of a more Cthulhu-style game, whatever these ancient aliens are doing that have been around since the foundation of this universe, think about what they're going to do to serve your world and story. In a certain sense, if they're out there, but they never intersect with anything that presents a challenge or informs the players in any way, you're kind of wasting your opportunity here. So make sure that whatever their agenda is, it's something that's rich with storytelling potential for you, and it's serving your game rather than the other way around.
So there's a lot of mistakes you can make in this creation process.
And we've made them.
So Ben, what are some of the things we want to avoid?
Well, I think one of the main things to do is don't obscure the player's agency or the cool power that they have in their characters by having these powers or elder beings show up too often. If some deity shows up in a game, it should happen once ever, maybe, and probably at the beginning or the end, or at like some really significant midpoint, right? But what you don't want to do is you don't want to have them always kind of lurk in the background, ready to essentially upstage the players at any given point, fix whatever problem they might have, or conversely, upset whatever victory they may have gotten if it's a evil power or something like that. How about you, Mark? What's another thing you would try to avoid with these powers?
Well, I would just say don't bully or penalize your players with your powers. I mean, you're not stat blocking them for a reason. You know that they're like an omnipresent type power. It's just not a fair thing to do your player. It belittles the player.
You're talking about, let's say, as a GM, you wanted them to take the right fork in the road, and the players are like, oh, we're going to take the left fork in the road.
Mm-hmm.
And your thought here is something like, don't have some god or huge power show up and essentially punish them for that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example. That could also be like, not necessarily bullying, but penalizing. You might penalize a player if you've put this entire pantheon together and a player decides, I want to be an atheist.
Right.
And now you're going to penalize them by letting all the other players in the group get these benefits that maybe that player doesn't get because they just choose a different path. It just shows weakness as a GM. Don't do it.
Remember that your powers, whatever they are, they're there to help your characters' stories come out. In spite of the fact that your characters may serve some deity or other in the context of the game, or even if they're fighting them, the point of having them there is to help bring out the characters' stories in this campaign. They're storytelling tools. So keep that in mind. And that's really true about everything. I mean, in terms of the geography you make, in terms of the way that you build the world, in terms of the NPCs, the little ones, at the inn or at the stable, and the big ones that are commanding the skies.
I'd also want to point out that we should try to avoid what we've been calling the divination trap. These are spells that are like maybe in games that allow you to commune with your deity and get information that you wouldn't otherwise have. Let's try to avoid that as much as possible. Let's not rely on items, spells. These are all other means to address your lack of good storytelling as a GM.
So what you're saying is, if I create some kind of mystery or some hidden thing, or, to find the door into the mountain that they've got to find, they've got to somehow successfully reach out to the gods and get that information. Maybe that doesn't happen, or maybe that makes them too reliant on one path to information. Is that the idea?
Yeah, you just don't want. These are things that should be addressed through the storytelling. These are things that make more sense when they've lived it and experienced it rather than just being told it. Because essentially that's what it comes down to. When you're using like a divination, you're just being told the answer to the question. You should be able to storytell.
What you have to do mainly here is Google lazy writing, and then you're going to know why this is a bad idea. Okay, cool.
Don't Google that because I don't want my name to be coming up.
All right, last thing I think is don't reduce the sacred to the mechanical.
Don't reduce that and counter it to a dice roll.
Don't reduce it to something where the players are really just saying, what's the difficulty I've got to roll over to beat this thing or to invoke this god or something like that. I would say, like, even when you're playing with regular old D&D cantrips, sacred flame, make that feel like something where the power of God is descending from the sky in radiant glory. What an amazing thing to see at that moment, right? Do what you can to keep those things special, interesting, and really powerful experiences, especially if you can. Okay, so we're going to start moving over into our other topic. We've talked a lot about what the different powers are like, and we're going to move away from the powers and talk about essentially the religious institutions now. So these are temples, churches, all of those kinds of things. So Mark, why is it that we might want to include institutionalized religious life in games?
We're world building here, Ben. We need to talk about religion as a generator of culture. This is where some of the culture might be derived from. Maybe not all of it, but you're going to get a lot of culture from the religion that's in that region.
Founding myths and music and things like that, right?
Yep, and there's great stories to be told within that context. Think about how that is going to drive the culture in that region while you're map making, while you're moving on to the next stages of campaign generation. You're going to want to keep that in the back of your mind.
You can have all kinds of cults or monastic orders, or Mark, what else kind of occurs to you? What are your kind of go-to faction types?
Well, I typically think of factions, particularly in like mythologies. You're talking about the different types of deities that might be diametrically opposed in some ways, which cause tension between the two. Maybe that is also a function of geography. Maybe there's some regions that in your realm, maybe some dark Ravenloft like lands where the dead don't stay dead. And then you have factions over here of light on the other side. So they can make for some interesting issues between those two. Think about how these religions could create factions, and conflict is good for your games. You want conflict.
So we've talked about a little bit about the differences between different types of religions. Look at the differences between ancient religion, medieval religion, modern religious institutions. Look at how different they are. Look at how, once upon a time people used to sacrifice and they don't really do that anymore. Why is that? What changed? That'll be a really interesting thing that could inform the way you think about this. When did religion start focusing so much on belief as opposed to just practice? When did the word religion get invented, right? All of the answers to those questions are going to enrich your way of thinking about what religion can be in your game as an institution, as a part of everyday life that people experience, as a source of power for your characters, or as a source of moral inspiration or terror, as we talked about. There's all kinds of interesting stuff there.
So yeah, like what kind of power do they wield socially? Like these institutions that we're talking about, how might they be organized? How are these groups forming? Where are they formed? Again, when you're doing your map making and you're thinking about these things, you're going to start filling in those little areas and what might be the type of people that populate them, including what type of religions.
Your characters might interact with sinister cults, inspiring reformers, monastic scholars, and they might be clued into all kinds of secret history that maybe most people in your world don't know about. And all of that's going to flow out of the institutions that you come up with.
Don't think that this is just relevant to fantasy games. There are futuristic settings that also include religion within the confines of their stories. You look at The Expanse, they have Mormons in space.
I thought that was fascinating when they did that. Yeah.
And if you read the book The Sparrow, you have Jesuits in space.
Yeah.
These are
they show up in some of the Orson Scott Card books too, the later books, I think, too.
Yeah, and if you look at it, some of this kind of makes a little bit it makes sense. I mean, these are religions here that like to expand their reach. They like to see new territories. So in these stories, at least in The Sparrow and also in The Expanse, these were religious institutions that wanted to preach the gospel out into the further reaches. So they were heading out into the great expanse, and it didn't go so well for some of them, but they're interesting stories.
What should we not do with organized religions in the context of our worlds?
Okay, so this is just one I do not like, and I cringe every time I see this at a table, is what we call stolen from the headlines. Probably a little bit more from Law and Order, but it's basically when you take real world happenings and insert them in your game. And maybe you're doing it as a way to kind of moralize on something, or maybe you're just doing it because you're lazy. I don't want to see it in my games. I play games to get away from that crap. So like, I don't want to see it in my games. Let's stay away from that. Let's avoid that if we can.
Cool. I would say the other thing to try to avoid when it comes to institutional religious practices that are native to your game world is be thoughtful about maybe not asking players to participate in that if they're not comfortable. For example, having players have to come up with, say, a prayer to a deity that you've made up for your game. There's going to be some players that are okay with that. There's going to be other players that are like, no, I actually am a regular deity-fearing person in real life. I have a regular religious faith, and I don't want to do that. And that's okay, too.
These are things you just want to communicate with your players. You just want to have the open line of communication so we don't have those awkward moments.
Yep. That's the big rule for everything as a GM is make sure you listen and help your players be their best selves. Okay. So, Mark, we're going to keep doing this series in the coming weeks, and we're going to have an interview episode, as we said, to kind of sprinkle in when it comes to maps. I think we're going to do mapping as our next episode. But before we get to all that, we have a tune-up segment this week. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I got a tune-up segment here. I got a message from a friend of mine, and it was a big message. So I kind of like summarized it into the form of a question or something we can work with. In the era of Uber builds and min-maxing YouTubers, how do I get players to embrace suboptimal builds and character flaws?
I love this question. And the reason I love this question is because I think your most triumphant moments as a player are going to be when you overcome some flaw, when you overcome some difficulty or some challenge.
Let's just define real quick what a character flaw might be before we jump right into it. Tell me a little bit what you're thinking about when you think of a character flaw.
When I'm thinking about character flaws, some of this is shaped by playing a bunch of games with champions and hero system and GURPS and some of those games where that's actually built in. It can be that kind of stuff. It doesn't have to be, but it's something where the character has a real challenge to operate optimally in your game. It's something where your character might have a fear of the dark, and so they really can't go into that dungeon. It's something where your character might have a fear of heights, and so they really are not willing to go at that airlock. It doesn't have to be fears. It could also be maybe they're poor. I mean, think about all the times where Spider-Man has problems because he's got money problems and he's trying to work it out and figure out how he's going to get out of this or that problem. It could be lots of different things.
I almost want to call it something other than character flaws, to be honest with you, because I find it a little bit like, these are just characters.
Yeah, I like what the current edition of Champions does. They call them complications.
Oh, that sounds great. That sounds better.
So I think however you figure it out, the point is there's something about your character's story that impedes their optimal flow, their optimal experience in combat, let's say.
Yeah.
Their optimal ability to uncover that mystery.
And when we talk about optimal, really what we're looking at is, because we're kind of in the internet age, and it doesn't take you long to go on YouTube and find somebody cranking out videos of just builds for games and how optimal this one is, how much damage this one does. And that's kind of what we're thinking about when we're combating in some sense.
Don't worry about whether your builds are suboptimal in that sense. Worry about whether they're story optimal for the kind of game you want to play. Is this the character that I think is going to be really awesome when he finally overcomes that thing and deals with the bully, or overcomes that fear and finally does go into that situation, or whatever it might be? I think thinking about it in terms of what you get out of the story, I think that's a great trade any day of the week for a few points of mechanical advantage.
And I think you want to bring most of the players on board with this type of thing. Because if you just have one player who's maybe wanted to make a suboptimal character, they're now put at quite a disadvantage as far as maybe not in the character development place, but they might feel a little bit like, why am I the only one having to do this to my character? Whereas, if you got more people in the group, kind of doing similar things, you're going to have more of an atmosphere of people enjoying that, embracing each other's suboptimal builds.
I love that. And I think this is, interestingly, if you think back to the discussion we had on character introductions, I think this is the flip side to that point about wanting the characters to be equal coming out of the gates. It's not always that they need to be equal in terms of they all have to be equally powerful. What you're saying here, I think, also makes sense. That they also need to be equally flawed, or equally complicated is maybe the better word that we like here.
And these complications, you could generate these in character background if the whole group decides to kind of start with this, or flaws can be acquired through story events. And actually, I've found that to be quite exciting. I've had opportunities to do some of this stuff in the game, and it just added to the story. It added to that character's growth and their hero's journey.
I think it's great. One little sort of thing to be aware of too is that if you introduce this to your players and all the players are in, it is very likely you're going to see players trying to find ways to negotiate their way around the way that flaws can intersect with the way that they want to play the game. And so you got to be a little bit careful. One of the interesting kind of meta rules around the games that actually have flaw mechanics, again, I'm thinking about Champions, is they have this phrase: if it's not a disadvantage, then you don't get points for it. In our context, it might say, look, if it never comes up because your character's lack of a car is offset by the fact that he's got a huge fortune and he can just whistle up a taxi wherever, then it's not going to be something that's a real flaw. That's not going to actually generate any story.
You also want to have mechanical consequences, don't you? Like, there needs to be a mechanical component to whatever this thing that's going on with your character. If your character, let's say, has a bad leg, there needs a mechanical consequence of, like, he can't move as far. And maybe his movement rate is not as far as a person of his size and build.
I would say that's the thing I would do first. But interestingly, because you're saying like this has to be negotiated with the players,
exactly,
I think it's also possible, if you agree and if they agree, to do versions of this where it's not necessarily mechanical, but it does show up. For example, let's say that you've got some kind of a flaw, like your character is like super ugly or terrifying in appearance. Well, let's say you hit town, whatever, however the space station, pick your favorite version of this. People run away from your character. They do not want to socialize with your character. You cannot get information out of people necessarily. You could represent that as just everybody runs the other way, or you could do that as a mechanical penalty to social checks of some kind. So however you do it, the point is make sure that it shows up And if you can, give it a kind of mechanical flow. But if people are a little shy about it, I think there's other ways you can emphasize it without maybe making them feel like they've got too much to overcome. I don't know. Mark, I'm not sure if this is something you agree with or not.
I do think it needs to have some sort of mechanical component to it. Otherwise, it's toothless because players will work their way around it. You will work your way around it as a GM. So we need to have some sort of real world, I don't want to say consequence, but it needs to have some real world ramifications. And the main thing is when we're talking about this, we make it sound like this is a horrible thing to have done to your character. We're like,
right.
Think about all the characters that you've enjoyed in movies and TV shows that have complications. There's a whole genre of brilliant detective shows where the main detective is socially inept.
Right.
You look at, Sherlock Holmes is kind of oblivious to social mores. He's also an addict. Let's not forget the fact that he was a heroin addict or something of that nature. So
I think it was a 7% solution to cocaine or something like that.
Yeah.
In the books,
so I'm just saying that these are interesting characters. Yeah. Do not let that dissuade you from playing them.
Just as an example, Mark, again, I think your point about having some mechanical bite as a kind of a commitment is interesting. We did something like this in one of our games where you give my character tinnitus. I get hit with a really hard mace in the head. And this was when we were fighting a boss.
Yeah, I do want to preface this. I had mentioned that we're getting into some areas of the game where we're going to be fighting a series of big bad bosses. And I wanted them to have some teeth. And I told the group, I said, hey, if this boss drops you, there's going to be consequences. You're not going to come away from these battles unchanged. And so what happened was you got your bell rung pretty good.
I sure did. I think in one shot, I went down from, I want to say like almost full hit points or maybe 2/3 at the lowest to like 1 hit point.
So at the end of the game, we did a little horse trading.
We did.
We talked about what the impact of some of those hits would mean and how we wanted to reflect that in the game to show that you're coming out of this experience changed.
Right. And my character got tinnitus, which is kind of a ringing in his ears. Now, as a swordsman, that's not directly going to impede certain things that he's going to want to do, but it is a significant disadvantage when it comes to maybe enemies getting the drop on you. I think the penalty is that it's disadvantage on sound perception checks and things like that. Yeah,
I believe that was what we came up with. Now, there could have been other things that we could have come up with, but that's what Ben came up with. And so like I allowed him, I said, hey, I want you to kind of tell me where you want to go with this because this is your character. I did state there's going to be some changes, but this is your character. I want him to change in the direction you feel comfortable with and are excited to go.
Well, friends, I think that's our tune-up segment for today. We have talked about all kinds of things to do with organized religion, with building the powers that shape your world. And this can happen in all kinds of different ways, depending on whether you're in a fantasy setting or a futuristic setting or even a modern setting like today. So stay tuned. We will have more for you in our world building series in the weeks to come. I think our next episode is going to be about mapping. Super excited about that. And in the meantime, until we get there, keep those dice rolling.